Talking about River Nile, and at this time of the year, the flooding of the Nile has been an important natural cycle in Egypt, not only in August, but throughout all. The River Nile as a source of life has been an important element in the lives of all Egyptians. And of course, it has been an important element for Egypt since ancient Egyptians. It has been celebrated by Egyptians in many walks of life, but especially in August 15th, known as Wafa al-Nil. It is also celebrated in the Coptic Church by ceremonially throwing martyrs' relic into the river, hence the name the martyr's finger or Isba al-Shahid. Ancient Egyptians believed that the Nile flooded every year because of Isis' tears of sorrow over her her dead husband Osiris. And of course, many stories more, and we're very delighted to be having with us live Dr. Fikri Hassan. He's a professor of archaeology and a historian. Hello, Dr. Hassan.
Good afternoon, Doctor. First of all, Doctor, I'd like to know the origin of the festival of Wafa al-Nil, or the fidelity of the Nile.
Well, as you just said, the Nile is the most important feature in Egypt. It is the source of life, and without it, it would never have been a civilization as we know it. And as a matter of gratitude, as a matter of recognition of the role of the Nile, there were the celebrations that continued throughout and became very prominent in Mamluk and Fatimid times, and even later on until very recently. And in fact, it's surprising that we are no longer celebrating the plenitude Wafa al-Nil, which was a major festival with boats on the Nile and activities and music and dance. And I think it is very important to renew such festivals, especially at a time when we are into issues that concern the amount of water coming to Egypt. So it has a very long history as a matter of recognition of the importance of the Nile, and particularly the flood. The Egyptians even had a special god for flood. It's called Habi, and he was represented as a man with pendulum breasts, indicating the fertility of Egypt, and the food that it provided also all was shown with food items associated with him. And the different governorates of Egypt were also recognized by statues of Hapi with the kind of food that it presented. He had a lot of temples also associated with him. And so there was a recognition of the time of flooding, which happens usually in August. That's why we have maybe this broadcast at this moment, and it usually celebrated in the first 2 weeks of August, because there was no precise date when the peak of the flood is reached. And the Egyptians were very interested in the timing of the flood, as well as the amount of the water coming. And in fact, it is very interesting because the taxes in Egypt were based on the productivity of the agricultural land, and the productivity of agricultural land depended on the amount of water coming. So when the Nile is very low, there would not have been a lot of agricultural products. When it's very high, the same thing. So what they have done to be just, they adjusted the taxes on the basis of how high the Nile is. So one of the major inventions in ancient Egypt was the invention of a Nilometer, a gauge by which they can measure how high the water level is. And it began with a stick, and then it ended up becoming special gauges associated with temples. And the last one we know before the Aswan High Dam was, of course, the Rhoda Nilometer, which is not very far from here. And when the level was reached, which is the plenitude, which in August, there was the celebration of Wafa al-Nil. So, because Wafa al-Nil, meaning that the Nile has honored its promise to Egypt. أوفى بكمية المياه اللي جاية. So this plenitude, it's reached the level of prosperity, and that was 16 cubits. They had a measure, again a human measure, which is based on the distance from the finger to the elbow, and that was called a cubit. And on the basis of that, they also divided into palms and fingers and the divisions. So when it reached 16 cubits, this was the level of plenitude, and they began the celebrations, and they can collect full taxes. If it is below that or higher than that, then they adjusted the amount of taxes that they collected.
Right. The River Nile, as we all know, played an important role in shaping the lives of Egyptians throughout ancient times, and until this very moment it has been a source of water, source of food, source of transportation, building materials, and you name it. Now, how did the element of the Nile contribute to building such a civilization of the Egyptian
well, the most important thing,
pharaohs?
of course, is the connection between the water and agriculture.
The water and
Water
the culture.
and agriculture.
Agriculture.
Cultivation of plants and to a certain extent, the raising of animals as well. And agriculture was introduced to Egypt about 7,000 years ago. And there were a lot of villages that were dispersed all along the Nile, and they depended on the amount of food that they can get out of their fields after the flood. That amount of water was never constant, and that's something that people do not realize, that the Nile is extremely variable. The only thing that is permanent, that it comes. But the amount, the timing, the shape of the flood itself, whether it comes once or several pulses, whether it stays long or does not stay, a lot of variables that affect the farmers. In addition to that, when the water comes, it changes the position of the channel itself. Now it doesn't move in Cairo because of the buildings and the kind of installation that we have. But in the past, it also moved. For example, people do not know that in about 200 years, most of Cairo was created. It was not there before. When you go to Old Cairo and you go to the Mosque of Amr ibn al-As, the Nile was right next to the mosque. And the areas of downtown Cairo, Khedive Cairo, and all that did not exist. This was a channel. So during the 13th century, all this was created by the movement of the floodplain from the east to the west, creating the area that was now most of Cairo as we know it. But before that, the extension of the Khalij al-Masri, the canal that was called the Khalij al-Masri that supplied Cairo water, was the position of the Nile. So it is now occupied by Sharia Port Said.
Yes.
But beyond that, to the west, did not exist. So all of these factors combine to indicate that the amount of water coming to your field, if you're a farmer, changes every year. And the only way to compensate for that, other than moving to somebody else, where if you are a farmer and you are stuck, you are there with your house and your granaries and all of that, is to cooperate with your neighbors. So that if we don't have enough food this year, we borrow it from our neighbors and we do the reverse afterwards. And as a result of that, we started to have a cooperative society. The bigger the groups that are combined in this cooperative venture, the better off they are. If there are only two of you and there are four people who are sharing, it's like a jam'iyya, like a society where people collect money and then get it at the end. The larger the number of the groups, the better off you are. When it comes large, then you need some formal management. If 2, 3, 4 people, it's okay. But when it becomes 15, 16, then you need a manager. And that is the beginning of Egyptian state. It's the emergence of managers to manage the cooperation between the people and to prevent any conflicts. Because in addition to that, the people who are on the Nile are farmers. They are in contrast with the people who stayed in the desert. And the people in the desert usually would come and try to take away or steal some of the food. So there was a need to ensure defense and ensure prosperity. So the first pharaohs, in a way, were guardians of the prosperity that comes with the Nile. they guarantee, so it became intertwined with religion. At the same time, they were shown beating the enemies that would come to take away the land from the Egyptians. So this is extremely important in the rise of Egypt's civilization and the rise of the state out of the connection with the agriculture and the fluctuations in the amount of food that comes to the people.
Doctor, there are other deities related to the river Nile, not only Hapi. For instance, we have the god Khnum in Aswan by the cataract area with his consort. We have Sotis and Anubis, one responsible for keeping the river within the banks, the other for directing the stream. We have also a mythology of Isis and how her tears formed the flood. Would you tell us more about these gods and these stories, please?
Well, it's as you mentioned, it is extremely important in Egyptian thinking that there are many gods and goddesses associated with the Nile. The hippopotamus, the frogs, for example. Khnum is probably one of the most important, which is the creator god. And he had the temple in Aswan where the Nile comes in. And the interesting thing also is the relationship between the Nile and the mud. And the Egyptian creation theory is that Khnum was fashioning human beings from the mud of the Nile on a potter's wheel. If you see the picture, you have the god Khnum making a statue of an individual, of a human being on the potter's wheel, and after that he is giving the breath from another goddess, and then he becomes animated as a human being. So the whole creation was connected to that. In fact, the mythology was that before the world was invented, there was water, and referred to as Nun. And of course, the Egyptian always connected the man and woman, so we have Nun and Nounet, the wife. And then when we get to the mythology, which is most important for kingship, because the Egyptian king was thought to be a reincarnation or production of the original god, Osiris. And Osiris was connected with the Nile. He was also connected with the conventional civilization itself, because with the farming, you get the cities and you get the artisans. So the whole thing was, because when you are a farmer, you needed a carpenter, to make the different activities. You need somebody else to do the iron smithing and so forth. So all the industries were related to agriculture, and so Osiris was connected not only with the water of the Nile, but also with the mud and the introduction of civilization. And it's very interesting that he's usually shown either as blue or black, which are the colors of the Nile. And the name of Egypt itself was Kemt, the black land, because to contrast it with the yellow desert. And the word desert, by the way, is from ancient Egyptian, desert, the same word. So the story of Osiris and his son Horus, which is the cardinal idea in the legitimization of Egyptian kingship, was based on the relationship between Osiris and his wife Isis and their son Horus, and that the story of evil and good, that he was the good god because of course he's guaranteed the prosperity of Egypt and its civilization, and he is envied by his brother Set, and so he's killed, and then Isis takes the son after she manages to be impregnated from the dead king after he has been courted and dispersed and connected. This is another very interesting story, because when he was murdered, he was cut into 40 pieces and thrown all over Egypt. And she went and connected them. This is an indication of the unity of the country. The country would not exist in fragments. So she managed to bring back Egypt by bringing his body together. And she managed, even though he was no longer living, to become pregnant with Horus, and then to take him to the Delta, again connection between Upper Egypt and the Delta, and to rear him, and then he comes out and becomes the legitimate king after the murder of the original king Osiris.
Right. Dr. Hassan, in spite of the fact that the river Nile passes or pass by the banks of many countries, I mean many countries share the banks of river Nile, but they don't share the same marvelous civilization, that amazing civilization that the ancient Egyptian possessed and created. They don't have it. How do you justify that fact?
Well, we are very lucky because we are downriver and we are not a mountainous area. When you look at Ethiopia, it's extremely mountainous. And when you look at the Sudan, the Nile is very strong, so it destroys the areas around it. Even in Nubia, the Nile is very, it flows very rapidly, and it's confined between the hills. When you're traveling going to Luxor or to Aswan, you see that the Nile is very close to the hills. So it's only when you have a large flat area and the Nile is mild that you can have the civilization. But the civilization is also based on that it's a very long river in Egypt. So in Egypt we are talking about 1,000 kilometers. So if it was a short river, you could not get a lot of productivity. And the higher the productivity, the higher the taxes to the elite, to the managers, who then can build the temples and can create the kind of things with. So it's a matter of the geographic position, and at the same time, the ability to bring these parts together. So that's why the unity of Egypt is very important. Another aspect that was very important is the fact that you can connect all of Egypt through the boat, by boats. So that's why the boats were very important. They transport goods and people, so that maintain the continuity, so that the king in Memphis would receive the goods that are coming all the way from Egypt. So because the amount of taxes you collect depends on the area from which you collect it. So the early kingdoms in Egypt were very small. We had a kingdom in area around Nagada. We had another area near Edfu. We had another area close to Abydos. So there were many little things. But once they were connected, then you had the flourishing civilization, because the larger the amount that is produced, because it depends on the production at the end, that we were able to be where we are. While in the Sudan, for example, it would be the closest to us, because they began the step toward agricultural change at the same time. But they have more rain than we do. So therefore, they could continue living in the desert, because the desert at that time was still green, and they could have their cows and their sheep and goats. In Egypt, you could not go to the desert and depend on sheep and cows, so you had to depend on agriculture. So the fact that they had this buffer, which looked at the time something good, so that it could continue to make, because as I mentioned, the Nile is very fickle, it's high, low. That's why at the end we needed to have the Aswan High Dam and the different dams that were created to regulate it, so that you can have the amount of water that we have. But if you don't have these installations, you need a river that is mild. And so in that area, they depended on something more stable, which is the rain in the desert, and therefore we bypassed them and quickly moved into a civilization. Within 2,000 years, we had our first pyramids, after they had just little villages that were dispersed around Egypt.
Well, yes, indeed. But I still think that also Egypt is the source of its people as well. But thank you very much, Dr. Fikri Hassan, Professor of Archaeology, for this insightful interview. And now we will be enjoying together the report about the Citadel Music and Singing Festival, and it's a concert for Lu'ay by Linda Abdel Latif, and we'll be back.